Well, my first DMT experience resulted in a painting that took me over a year to do. It was the Transfiguration painting. Sometimes I think the early psychedelic or entheogenic experiences are some of the most impactful if you get a proper dose, I guess. And for me, that was the case. I got 2 visions on my first trip that took me for practically a year and a half of painting, and I like to manifest something from the experience before I go tripping again. I feel like you're given a gift, so do something with it. Integrate it somehow into your life, instead of just bending your mind again. It's like panning for gold in the superconscious or something.
I started doing psychedelics when I entered college, and my first psychedelic experiences were recreational. They were not spiritual. They were purely, with friends at parties and whatever. And then I read the book Be Here Now by Ram Dass, and it inspired me to trip and look for the white light. So I did that with a friend, a very close friend, and I saw the white light. I had never even thought of looking for the white light, and I wasn't leading a spiritual life, but everything seemed unified. And interconnected. All beings and things were unified by this light that ran through everything, inanimate and animate. All things were connected. And my friend did not have that experience. He was cynical and existentialist and political, and we disagreed on that. He couldn't see it, and he thought that it was just absurd, nihilistic and whatever. So that kind of enhanced my feeling of. And later on, I had a very negative psychedelic experience where I was really caught up in the religiosity of it. I saw plaster Jesuses and Marys coming out of the snow, and none of my friends were having a spiritual experience. I felt very isolated by that experience until I met Alex, who was the first person, and that was years later, who actually had a psychedelic experience and talked to me about the sacredness of it and the spiritual experience that was an opening for him. So that was a profound connection with Alex, and that was the beginning of our relationship.
I think I was in college. It was probably around 1986. No, later. Late 80s, early 90s. So this is Terence McKenna's stuff. And Reality Hackers magazine and those kinds of publications. Pre-Mondo 2000. And I hadn't tried it until I got to Taos. And I met some people that made it and sampled, smoked, and enjoyed.
How did I first hear about dimethyltryptamine or DMT? I think it was probably when I was in my late 20s, and I had gone through this kind of spiritual and existential crisis, and I began to get interested in psychedelics again. And in college, I'd taken mushrooms and LSD a handful of times. And so I began to just read more and think more about psychedelics, and learned about Terence McKenna's work and ayahuasca and DMT. So I was probably in my late 20s. It was probably about 12, 13 years ago. I don't know. I still lay even odds that it was legitimate transmission from galactic center.
I think I first heard about DMT by reading a book by a certain Dr. Rick Strassman, it focused my mind on an intriguing possibility. I was already interested in the issue of consciousness, and I'd come to it through a completely different direction, which was cave art. Scientists have been studying cave art for the last 100 years, but for almost all of that period there hasn't been a viable theory as to what the ancient artists were presenting. Really, in the last 20 years, a new idea has come forward that those were shamans in altered states of consciousness, and that they were painting the beings, the experiences the encounters that they had in altered states of consciousness. And actually, once you apply this model to cave art, it makes complete and absolute sense of all the imagery that you see in all the painted caves, and not just in Europe, but really all over the world, that there's some kind of universal experience in an altered state of consciousness going on here, which is being probably the earliest documentation of those experiences are on the cave walls. And that then led me to ask, if I'm going to explore this further, what can I do as a researcher? I need to experience altered states of consciousness myself, and that's really where I started to come across DMT and the notion that this might be a good way to explore altered states of consciousness, particularly DMT within the ayahuasca brew, which is used by shamans today.
Yeah, so the 3D graphic of meditation basically shows all the different changes that we think occurs during a meditation practice, and it starts out with increased activity in the frontal lobes. When the person is focusing their attention on their sacred object, if you will, they are focusing their attention, and that causes an increase of activity in the frontal lobes of the brain, which help us to do that. As that process goes on, it begins to recruit activity in other parts of the brain, such as the thalamus, which is a very key relay and a very key sensory relay in the brain. It also, if the person is doing a visual meditation, then it will activate the visual areas of the brain. If they're doing a verbal type of practice, like a mantra, it'll activate the language areas of the brain. And when it does this, what we think is happening in a part of the brain called the parietal lobe, which is located towards the back top part of the brain, we think that there's an initial increase of the activity in that area because they're orienting themselves towards this meditative object. As the practice continues, though, they begin to have changes not only in the frontal lobe, but also in the limbic areas, because these are very emotional experiences. And with all of this happening, it also begins to block sensory information as it gets into some of these other areas, like the orienting area of the brain in the parietal lobe. If it does this to a large extent, then the person continues to have an orientation of the self, but no longer has the information upon which to do that. And we think that that's associated with a loss of the sense of self. And in fact, going back to psychedelic drugs, some of the effects that people have seen in blood flow and metabolism in the brain seem to be some of these sensory areas in the frontal lobes that seem to be particularly affected by these drugs and the experiences that are associated with them. Now, in addition to all of this going on, we also expect there to be changes in the autonomic nervous system. So going down to the body itself, we see changes that stimulate both a sense of arousal in some circumstances and a sense of calmness and quiescence in another set. And sometimes you even have a mutual turning on of both of them. People talk about sort of an ecstatic bliss, and obviously it can be a very powerful experience. And of course, the brain has two sides, so as you do these practices, it ultimately affects both sides. And again, my overall model for all of this is that it's a very complicated process. There's not just one part of the brain that's associated with these experiences, but it involves many different parts. And depending on how those parts are activated, whether it's sort of top down through a practice like meditation, whether it's bottom up through some kind of ritual practice, whether there's a drug effect, whether there's some other type of ritual effect, all of them can induce slightly different kinds of experiences and slightly different states for that person, and change how they view the world and how they experience the world. So that's that three-dimensional view of the brain. And then when you look at the brain scans, what we do find are areas of increased activity, increased blood flow in the frontal lobes, right behind the forehead. When people are focusing on their meditation practice, we see decreases of activity in the parietal lobe, which again we think is associated with a kind of a loss of the sense of self and a diminishment of the sense of space and time associated with that. We see increases of activity in the thalamus, which, because we think it is a very active process and can have a lot of sensory kind of phenomena that are associated with it. So there are a lot of changes, and we see this in meditation, in our Tibetan Buddhist meditators, in our Franciscan nuns who are doing prayer. We saw, and even when people are speaking in tongues, a very unusual state, and in many ways kind of this unusual state because they feel like they're being taken over by God's presence, and the Spirit of God is making these unusual vocalizations out of their mouth. What we see is that the areas of the brain in the frontal lobe that normally help them with language and controlling the things that they do with their willful control, these actually shut down in that case. So it's kind of the opposite effect of what you see during a heavily intensive meditation practice. They actually lower the activity in the frontal lobes when they're speaking in tongues. And of course, again, the big question then is, so if the parts of the brain that are associated with language are shut down, then what's doing it? And to them, it's the Spirit of God, and an atheist might say, well, it's just part of the brain taking, another part of the brain taking over.